اس کے جواب کے لیے علماء حق بھی میدان میں آئے، لیکن بدقسمتی سے اس میدان میں نمایاں حیثیت آن جہانی غلام احمد قادیانی کو حاصل ہو گئی، جس نے 1883 میں اپنی تالیف سرمہ چشم آریہ ہی کے ذریعے وہ ہر دل عزیزی حاصل کی تھی، کیونکہ باقی علماء میں یہ استعداد اتنی نہیں تھی یا ان کا شغف نہیں تھا، ذوق نہیں تھا۔ اس شخص نے خاص اس میدان کے اندر جو ایکسپرٹیز ہے، جو درکار ہے، مہارت وہ حاصل کی اور آریوں کے ساتھ مناظرے کیے، انہیں شکستیں دی اور کتاب لکھی سرمہ چشم آریہ۔ نتیجہ یہ ہوا مسلمانوں میں پاپولر ہو گیا۔ ظاہر بات ہے حملے کا جواب دے رہا ہے، مسلمانوں کی طرف سے مدافعت کر رہا ہے، مسلمانوں کی طرف سے مدافعت کر رہا ہے۔ چنانچہ مولانا ثناء اللہ امرتسری کے بارے میں آتا ہے، اہل حدیث، وہ یہ کہتے ہیں کہ ایک زمانے میں میں اس کا وضو کرانا اپنے لیے باعث سعادت سمجھتا تھا، اور بڑے بڑے علماء نے اس کی تعریفیں کی۔ علامہ اقبال نے کہا اگر کسی کو صحیح اسلام دیکھنا ہو تو قادیان میں جا کے دیکھے،
کیونکہ یہ عیسائیوں کو جواب دیتے تھے۔
تحریک پاکستان ہی نہیں، خود جو ہے مولانا ابوالکلام آزاد، مولانا ثناء اللہ امرتسری، اصل میں یہ ایک خاص دور تھا جب کہ اسلام کے خلاف ایک تو عیسائی
متاثر تھے، یہ
خود تھے، یہ
غلام رسول مہر اور
عبدالمجید سالک احمدی تھے۔
میری اطلاع نہیں ہے یہ، بہرحال میں جو عرض کر رہا ہوں وہ یہ کہ جو کام وہ کر رہا تھا اس نے تو عیسائی مشنریز کے ساتھ مناظرے کیے اور انہیں شکستیں دی۔
کس نے؟
عیسائی مشنریز کو ساتھ مناظرے کر کے غلام احمد نے انہیں شکستیں دی۔
اچھا۔
اور ایک زبردست جو ایک وائلنٹ تحریک اٹھ گئی تھی، یہ ستیارتھ پرکاش کا جو مصنف تھا، آریہ سماج، تو آریہ سماج کے لوگوں سے بھی اس نے مناظرے کیے اور انہیں شکستیں دی۔ اچھا، ان دو چیزوں کی وجہ سے علماء کی آنکھوں کا تارا بن گیا۔
احمد خان نے بھی مولانا سید میر حسن کو منع کیا تھا کہ ان کے ساتھ جھگڑا کرنے کی ضرورت نہیں ہے، ہمیں کیا ان کا جو بھی عقیدہ ہے عقیدہ رہے ان کے پاس، لیکن ہمیں اس سے کوئی غرض نہیں۔ لیکن سنا ہے کہ آدمی بڑا صالح اور نیک ہے، اور وہ مقابلہ کرتے تھے ان عیسائیوں سے۔
نہیں، مگر یہ ثبوت موجود ہے کہ وہ متاثر ہوئے تھے، جیسے شروع میں کہا تھا انہوں نے پروگرام سے کہ بہت سے لوگ متاثر ہوئے۔ مرزا غلام احمد کے بارے میں انہوں نے یہ لکھا ہے ایک جگہ کہ اس دور، یہ 1898-99 کی بات ہے، کہ اس دور میں مرزا غلام احمد جس طرح اسلام کو سمجھے ہیں ایسا بہت کم لوگ سمجھے ہیں۔
میرا یہ خیال ہے کہ وہ کبھی بھی احمدی نہیں تھے، البتہ غلام احمد کی تعریف انہوں نے کی، اور جو آپ نے جملہ نوٹ کیا ہے میں نے اس کے برعکس یہ سنا ہے کہ انہوں نے کہا کہ اگر کوئی شخص آج اسلام زندہ دیکھنا چاہے تو قادیان میں جا کے دیکھے۔
الوقت يدعو مصلحا ومجددا فرنوا بنظر طاهر وجنان۔
السلام علیکم ورحمۃ اللہ وبرکاتہ۔ Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad alayhi salam was the greatest defender of Islam and a lover of the Prophet Mohammed sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and he defended Islam from the Christians, Hindus, and also the atheists and opponents of Islam in his time, and he wrote the greatest literature defending Islam from every single opponent who came forward. We will show the defense of Hazrat Ahmad alayhi salam and how beautifully he defended the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam from allegations. Then we will show how the scholars of Adnan Rashid defended the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. The allegation the Hindus and Christians raised against the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam was that God forbid he made his adopted son Hazrat Zaid radiyallahu anhu divorce Hazrat Zainab radiyallahu anha just so he could marry her, God forbid, and that he looked at her and fell in love with her, God forbid. Let us see how Hazrat Ahmad alayhi salam beautifully defended our master Hazrat Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. In Arya Dharam, which is one of the greatest books in the defense of Islam, Hazrat Ahmad alayhi salam quotes the verse of the Quran that call your adopted sons by their fathers' names. Then he says this is a Quranic teaching, but since God was pleased to establish the example of his pure prophet by abolishing the detestable practice when the freed slave's wife of the Holy Prophet ﷺ faced severe censure from her husband, it eventually led to divorce. Then when the divorce was finalized from the husband's side, Allah the Exalted established the marriage bond with the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And the meaning of reciting the marriage contract by God does not imply that Zainab and Hazrat Muhammad ﷺ did not willingly accept it, and it was against Zainab's will. This is completely baseless, and if they are truthful, they must provide evidence for this accusation from authentic ahadith or the Quran. It is not even known that in Islam, the one reciting the marriage contract does not have the authority to forcibly impose the marriage. Rather, the consent of both parties is essential before the marriage contract is recited. In summary, it is clear that one cannot become a son or a mother just by words. For example, if we ask the Aryans that if one of them, in a fit of anger or deception, calls his wife a mother, would she become forbidden to him, and would a divorce occur? This notion is absurd because divorce in Aryan religion cannot happen in any way, whether one calls his wife a mother once or 1,000 times. Another objection is based on the claim that Zainab radiallahu anha did not willingly accept the marriage proposal from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and it was only by way of force by God's command. In response to this, we have already written that it is an extremely baseless accusation with no mention or evidence in our books. If they are truthful, then show us from the Quran or a hadith. If it is not an accusation, then tell us where it is written in our books, whether in the Quran or Bukhari and Muslim. After the Quran, the most two authentic books are Bukhari and Muslim. So provide evidence from the Quran, Bukhari or Muslim that the marriage was against Zainab's will and was decreed. Clearly in the situation where Zainab radiallahu anha was not pleased with Zaid, who was the freed slave of the Prophet ﷺ, and due to this Zaid had given her a divorce because of her dissatisfaction. Zainab had been brought up in the house of the Prophet ﷺ and was grateful and was among his relatives. So what could be a better and more honorable place for Zainab radiallahu anha than leaving the captivity of a slave and entering into the marriage of the monarch, who was not only the prophet of God and the seal of the prophets, but also held the crown of worldly kingship and sovereignty, causing emperors and kings to tremble in awe. Then Hazrat Ahmad ﷺ writes, Zainab was the woman whom the Prophet ﷺ had married to Zaid, and she was raised under his care. She was an orphan girl whom the Prophet ﷺ had taken care of, and she saw that the wives of the Prophet ﷺ were sitting on the throne of honor. The Prophet ﷺ knew that if Zaid divorced her, most likely God would decree the marriage for him to establish an example for the people, and indeed this happened. The story is explicitly mentioned in the Quran. Then those with wicked nature who always desire to spread false accusations created stories that the Prophet ﷺ was inclined towards Zainab. However, Zainab was not distant, and she was not a woman who the Prophet ﷺ had never seen. It was Zainab who matured before the Prophet's eyes in his household. The Prophet himself, not anyone else, married her to his freed slave. This marriage was initially disapproved by Zainab and her brother. The Prophet ﷺ made numerous efforts to gain her consent, but dissatisfaction was the reason Zaid, the freed slave, divorced her. This dissatisfaction eventually led to Zaid being freed. Then these unlawful people created their own stories about the Prophet ﷺ's desires and accused him of wrongdoing. And it is vile to spread baseless accusations while leaving the authentic events. The Quran is present and Bukhari and Muslim are present. Bring forth where it is mentioned that the Prophet ﷺ desired the marriage of Hazrat Zainab radiallahu anha for himself. In fact, the Prophet ﷺ repeatedly discouraged Zaid from giving divorce to Hazrat Zainab radiallahu anha. These are the facts which we have written, and they are from the Quran and a Hadith. However, if someone claims otherwise, they should prove their assertion with evidence from our recognized books. Otherwise, it is an act of disbelief and betrayal. What Allah the Almighty says, I have recited the nikah, means that this marriage is in accordance with my will, and I desired it to happen so that there would be no burden on the believers. This does not imply that Zainab's consent should be forcibly taken. It is clear that the status of the one who performs the nikah is not to refer an accusation against any woman to her husband's male relatives. Instead, the nikah is based on the will of the woman. So Allah's nikah means that Zainab's heart inclined towards the Prophet, and Allah directed him to do so to avoid any burden on the community. Now here is Kashful Mahjub. Let us see how the scholar of Adnan Rashid blasphemed against the Prophet Mohammed sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He says, चुनाचे ऐसा ही हुआ कि दाऊद अलैहिस्सलाम की नज़र वहाँ पड़ी जहाँ पड़नी ना चाहिए थी. The Hazrat Daud अलैहिस्सलाम looked where he should not have looked. Now he is referring to the biblical blasphemy of Hazrat Daud अलैहिस्सलाम, यानी एक औरत पर जो ओरिया की औरत थी, यानी दाऊद looked at the wife of Uriah, and then he says जिसे देखा वो उन पर हराम थी, और जब बंदा बहक कायम हो गया जैसे हजूर सल्लल्लाहु अलैहि वसल्लम. So he mentions the story attributed to Hazrat Daud alayhi salam, and then he gives the example of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and says इस तरह ज़ैद रदी अल्लाह अन्हु की बीवी पर, मगर वो बीवी ज़ैद पर हराम हो गई इसलिए कि वो नज़र जो दाऊद अलैहिस्सलाम की थी वो महल साहब में थी, और ये नज़र जो हजूर सल्लल्लाहु अलैहि वसल्लम की थी ये महल सुकर में थी. So he says that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he looked at Zainab radiallahu anha, she became haram for Zaid radiallahu anhu. Now the Muslims can decide who defended Hazrat Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and Hazrat Zainab radiallahu anha, the scholars of Adnan Rashid or the Messiah and Imam Mahdi, Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad alayhi salam.